Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is wrapped in so many layers of turbulent change. I've stopped listing them on this show as Sustain What, which started early in the pandemic. And we have an infodemic, we have geopolitical crisis, we have very strange and disturbing politics, we have climate change, we have all the usual environmental issues. And there are two things that are at the heart of a lot of those environmental issues, and to me, the ethical issues are energy and food. And in the food arena, the big one in terms of land impacts and so many other things is meat. On Earth, way back in my New York Times days, I started to envision pathways past the slaughter part of meat. And PETA, the animal welfare group, at the same time, in the aughts, was pressing the case for alternatives. And PETA, interestingly and dramatically, got into the idea of actually put up money so people could push forward with substitutes with actually lab-grown meat. It was frontier days back then, and now it's sort of high gear. And there's no better person to explore this kind of issue with the future of meat and alternatives to meat than Bruce Friedrich, was at PETA back in those days, as you can see here with the klaxon and very much in an activist mode. And now he's wrangling a big project, a global food institute, a good food institute, right? I had it right in front of me.
Yep.
And a network around the world that's pressing for advancing alternatives, so that alternatives to the thing that requires killing an animal and deforesting the tropics, etc., is actually the preferable thing to do, just because it's better. It's better and cheaper and tastier and gives you all the things that meat has given us historically as a species, but without the downsides. And he has a new book out on this, Meat: How the Next Agricultural Revolution Will Transform Humanity's Favorite Food and Our Future. And the Good Food Institute has a new set of reports out on where we're going and what the impediments are and what the accelerants are. And we're just going to dive right in. And thanks for being on Sustain What.
I'm delighted to be here, Andy. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And I think we'll start also before we get into the sort of ABCs of this, let's start with the news. Cultivated meat, which is one of the phrases for this phenomenon, is in headlines these days. And wouldn't you know, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who likes to eat roadkill or the like, he was testifying just yesterday. Maybe it was yesterday. Senators and congressmen were giving him digging in on this idea of lab meat. I don't know if you've been tracking these hearings, but it's in the news. Florida has a protectionist approach, and maybe you could summarize what your take is right now on the state of the politics of post-slaughter meat, and then we're going to get into all the details of the book and everything.
Yeah, I mean, I have an article in Foreign Policy recently that begins with 11 Republican members of Congress writing to the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of Homeland Security about the importance of the United States prioritizing their both plant-based meat and cultivated meat industries. When the Protein Innovation Caucus launched, it was 14 Republicans and 14 Democrats. And the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the top national security think tanks in the world, maybe the top national security think tank in the world, released a report about alternative proteins that really underlined that this is an economic competitiveness issue, and it's a food security, food systems resilience issue. And if you look globally, people like Prime Minister Narendra Modi, obviously very conservative, people like Benjamin Netanyahu, also very conservative, President Xi of China, very conservative, even Bolsonaro, when he was president of Brazil, and still Lula, are very supportive of alternative proteins. So there's a bit of a, I mean, there's some degree of partisan-ishness to it in the U.S., but probably far less than the vast majority of the issues. There are quite a few Republicans who are champions of alternative proteins, generally for competitiveness with China reasons or economic competitiveness, or simply looking at globally, where are the entrepreneurs, where are the innovators, where is the science happening? And it's predominantly in the US. And do we want to, basically, do we want to lose the innovation and science war to other countries when we're currently winning it?
That's such an interesting point. Although you have that competitiveness issue, and China clearly in the lead on a lot of these questions, which we'll talk about in a minute. But we've seen that also with energy, and here the U.S. On the energy front, or at least under the current administration, is in the same mode of not really putting in the foreground those long-term competitiveness issues, unless I'm missing something. So this must be incredibly frustrating for you.
I mean, it's I don't know. I mean, if you look at just how partisan things have gotten in the U.S., the fact that we do have lots of support from across the aisle, and even the meat industry. Like if you look at the meat industry, the Meat Institute, they represent, I think, 97% of meat production in the U.S. They're supportive of cultivated meat. Tyson, JBS, Cargill, all of the major meat companies are supportive. And there is, there are some, I think, sort of MAGA Republicans who will try to turn it into a political issue, but mostly not there either. So I think as long as we stay away from telling people what to eat, and we do stay away from telling people what to eat. So, I mean, this is about choice. It's about innovation. It's about small business. It's about global competitiveness. It's about food systems resilience. And as long as we keep focused on that, my hope and expectation is that it'll be significantly less partisan than most things in politics. And so far, that's been true.
What was it you mentioned? There was a caucus that's focused on this in Congress.
Yeah, the Protein Innovation Caucus.
Protein Innovation Caucus.
Yeah, and it's focused on plant-based and cultivated meat. But I mean, even Kennedy's testimony, like considering how willing he is to sort of go out on a limb on things, the idea that you're going to have to get through a lot of skepticism to show that they're safe. I mean, the U.S. Donald Trump in his first 90 days approved more cultivated meat products than Joe Biden did in 4 years. It was also Donald Trump's Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, and his FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, who agreed that new regulations wouldn't need to be promulgated, and they came up with the protocols under which safety would be evaluated. So, of course, the FDA should be skeptical of new foods. The FDA should have rigorous protocols for regulatory approval, and they do. And cultivated meat companies have jumped through those proverbial hoops. And I really think RFK was just sort of saying a few things that are true.
Yeah. Well, that's promising, and it does sound like, I wrote a lot about GMOs back in the day, and I think the bar is lower for this in terms of, bars are. Let's forget that metaphor. It seems that people are there's more openness to this than there was back in that fight, and that fight proved to be on the left and some parts of the right, really not science based, and but you seem to be ahead of the game when we think back to what things were like back then.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And I think it's really been helpful that organizations like Heritage Foundation and Reason Magazine and the Dispatch and even Meeting Place Magazine, the publisher of Meeting Place Magazine, which is the big meat industry trade group. So Meeting Place is spelled MEAT. All of them have said we are not the nanny state. We are not the ones that stomp on competition, and have come out in favor of fair competition, in favor of clear regulatory protocols, and so on. So cautiously optimistic that that will continue. So, I mean, Kennedy was asked at a hearing by a senator from South Dakota about this issue, and he answered honestly. But we haven't seen any indication that the Trump administration is antagonistic, and in fact, really quite the opposite.
That's good. Well, let's hope that that can continue. I put up a slide a minute ago about the price of the old-fashioned slaughter kind of meat, and is this something that's in your favor too? Has this already started to show up in terms of investment interests?
No, I don't think so. I mean, investment interest is down, and I don't think that is going to change until the products come down in price and start getting better. There are some bargains at the VC and investor level now, just because, and really, I mean, investor interest is down across kind of all technologies other than AI recently, and that's true here as well. But I think we're either going to need to see sales go up, or we're going to need to see, as we have, some very innovative companies, and those companies, I think, will have an easier time. It was true a few years ago that just like any company that said we're the next Impossible Foods, and VC investors would throw money at them. And as I talk about in the book, many of them didn't have a chief science officer, they didn't have an R&D budget. So in the book, I think that section of the book is called "You're Not the Next Impossible, You're the Next Gardenburger." So some self-inflicted wounds there, unfortunately.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get going here then. And we'll start with the Good Food Institute. You do have these new reports out. Maybe you could just quickly kind of run around the circle and say what the state of the business is in terms of this transition. And again, it still reminds me a lot of the energy transition questions. So what's going on? And I have the link for the report here.
Oh, cool. Thank you. I mean, I dive in. So GFI, the Good Food Institute, we have about 240 full-time staff, a little north of that. The plurality of our team members are scientists. We are a global science think tank. There are 6 GFIs. So GFI in the US is sort of the mothership. And then we have GFI India, GFI Israel, Brazil, Asia Pacific, which is based out of Singapore. And then we also have small teams in Japan and Korea. And then GFI Europe, which is based in the UK. And we also have teams in Germany and focused on the European Commission in Brussels. So that's GFI around the world. Our primary goal is building a maximally robust scientific ecosystem. And that's going extraordinarily well. I mean, it's if you think about how long 10 years is in kind of stories of innovation, it's not very long. And 10 years ago, there was no Impossible Burger. There was no Beyond Burger on the plant-based side. There had never been a plant-based meat conference 10 years ago. There had been one cultivated meat conference in the previous October, and there were 2 scientists working on cultivated meat at the entire conference. It was about 20 scientists, and most of them were friends of Mark Post, one of the sort of 2 pioneers of cultivated meat. And they were tissue engineers working on human therapeutics, or they were meat scientists working on conventional meat science. And he brought them in to speculate about cultivated meat. And then he and a woman at the University of Bath in the UK named Marianne Ellis were the 2 scientists, both tissue engineers, who were actually doing some work on cultivated meat at that conference. No government funding for cultivated or plant-based meat from 2006 until 2020. And the first big grant for cultivated meat was Donald Trump's National Science Foundation, $3.55 million for UC Davis to set up a cultivated meat consortium. And now there are probably 30 different governments funding plant-based meat and cultivated meat. Every government that funds significant biotechnology is funding plant-based and cultivated meat, as well as every government that funds agriculture. And that's why GFIs in the countries we're in, our only 2 metrics are, does the government fund a lot of science? And does the country have world-class scientific institutions that can help to solve some of the challenges of plant-based and cultivated meat? at price and taste parity, because that's really the challenge. And the inspiration is energy transition. The inspiration is a recognition that meat consumption just keeps going up. So yes, let's continue to encourage people to eat less or no meat. But that is the strategy of the last 60 plus years, even as meat consumption just keeps going up.
Right.
Just like energy consumption is going to keep going up, just like number of cars on the road and number of miles driven is going to keep going up, meat consumption is going to keep going up. So just like we need renewable energy and we need electric vehicles, we also need plant-based and cultivated meat. And we're seeing the same sort of trajectory that has happened with energy transition that is happening with plant-based and cultivated meat. So by the end of 2016, there were 4 peer-reviewed articles on the science of cultivated meat that had ever been written in all of human history. In 2024, there were 40 times that number in 1 year alone. It goes up and up and up. It's not nearly enough, but it's certainly trending in the right direction.
That is just mind blowing. Really is.
Yeah, I mean it's good to see, and I mean another thing that's I think is interesting is up until 2021 there weren't any research reports about plant-based and cultivated meat. So in the same way that you would have every climate think tank on the planet has probably put out multiple research reports focused on everything from bioengineering to carbon dioxide removal, certainly, and obviously things like solar and wind, and nuclear fission and fusion. There was nothing on plant-based or cultivated meat until 2021. And now there are a bunch, including endorsements from the UN Environment Program, from the World Bank, from the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis, and many more. So things are trending in the right direction on that as well.
Why do you think it took so long for this to get into gear? I mean, again, PETA, we'll go back to your PETA years a little bit, but I mean, the ethical case has been there for a long time. The environmental case has been there for a long time. When I wrote my book about the Amazon in 1989, 1990, season was a big chunk of it was about ranching, moving into the Amazon. And you would have thought this possibility was it technology constrained or just was there an ideological, I don't know, you've thought about this a lot. It's in your book a little bit, but why did it take until now for this to get into gear?
I mean, I think it's technology constraints and lack of human imagination. So in the same way that human beings just really struggle to imagine a reality in the future that's different from the reality of the present, and it does take innovators to come along and challenge preconceived notions. So in the book, I talk about things like penicillin. Fleming won the Nobel Prize for penicillin in 1945. He discovered it in 1928. He worked very hard from 1928 to 1941 to find somebody to fund his work. No one would fund it. In 1941, the Rockefeller Foundation gave a grant to some scientists to basically travel by boat to the United States and pitch penicillin to the US government, which had just, as a part of the war effort, started an Office of Science and Technology, or Office of Research and Development, I think. And fortunately, they ended up saying, yeah, let's give this a shot. And then they twisted the arms of the pharmaceutical industry, which was not interested in figuring out whether penicillin would work. So it was part of the war effort and basically under government orders. And then boom, now we have penicillin. It could have sat on a shelf for another decade or two if that had not happened. There's an even more sort of egregious story about mRNA, which was how we made lightning speed progress on vaccine development during COVID. And the researcher, Katie, I can't remember her last name, she won the Nobel Prize for medicine in, I think, 2023. And she was basically kicked out of University of Pennsylvania, where she was a researcher. She couldn't get tenure. And year after year after year, she was trying to get somebody to pay attention to her theory, and she couldn't get anybody to pay attention. And it really was just her incredible fortitude, which is responsible for mRNA ever seeing the light of day. And there are just so many examples like that. So, Bill Gates talks about how until the advent of alternative meats, he thought agriculture was going to be like absolutely the hardest challenge in climate change mitigation, because it had not occurred to him or anyone else that we could make meat from plants that was indistinguishable. It hadn't occurred to anybody that we could make cultivated meat, which was literally the exact same thing, but instead of requiring farms and slaughterhouses, we can do it in something that looks like a brewery. And it required people, innovators, to come along and say, challenge all of the sort of preconceived notions and say, why not? Let's try. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a tremendous amount of progress, considering how little money has gone into these challenges.
So it's possible that we'll see a really maybe explosive is too fast a word, but now that things are getting into gear, and now that you have issues with constraints such that even China is pushing hard in this kind of area, things could really rapidly change. You're also reminding me of something that Jesse Ausubel at Rockefeller University said a very long time ago about the basic reality of meat being part of our lives. He said, in a wider way, he said this, and I've tweeted this many times and written about it: because the human brain does not change, technology must. And the human brain is not just our genetic. We don't have a genetic predisposition necessarily to this thing, but there's an experiential norm of this thing on the plate. It's a very dense source of protein and has certain characteristics. So technology, without changes in technology, we will eat the planet, as Michael Grunwald has said. And I'm glad for everything you're doing on this front. So let's get to the book. You start with the problem. Why would we need to do this anyway? Maybe you could take through those key areas that I already understand, but just for those who are watching who might not.
Yeah, chapter 1 is about hunger and malnutrition. And I think this makes intuitive sense. It takes about 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. 8 of those calories go mostly into the chicken simply leading their life. And then some of it goes into things like feathers and bone and blood that we don't consume. But basically, it takes 900 calories to get 1 calorie to get 100 calories from a chicken. And farmed fish, pork, and beef are even worse. And that is just an incredibly inefficient and land-intensive process. And it's not just that it takes 9 times the land, 9 times the water, 9 times the herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, but then you are shipping those crops to a feed mill. You're operating the feed mill. You're shipping the feed to the farm. You're operating the farm. You're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse. You're operating the slaughterhouse. It's multiple extra stages of gas-guzzling, pollution-spewing vehicles and multiple extra energy-intensive and polluting factories. And when you crunch all of those inefficiencies and you look at the environmental consequences, which is chapter 2. So chapter 1 is basically the inefficiencies drive up the price of land, drive up the price of crops, and lead to hunger and malnutrition. Chapter 2 is all of those inefficiencies mean that, according to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, whatever environmental issue you're looking at, from the smallest and most local to the largest and most global, animal agriculture is one of the top 3 causes. For things like biodiversity loss and deforestation, water pollution, water use, animal agriculture is the number 1 cause. And the remarkable thing about that is that report is now 20 years old. We're now producing an extra 105 million metric tons of meat, 40% more meat than we were when that report issued the clarion call about the environmental consequences. Chapter 3 is about antimicrobial resistance and the fact that about 70% of medically important antibiotics are fed to farm animals throughout their entire lives. So if you get sick, you might go on a course of antibiotics over something like 10 days, but that will be, every however many years. Your doctor puts you on antibiotics. Farm animals are fed antibiotics for their entire lives. Because if you cram 50,000 chickens into a shed, death losses are going to be really high, if not for prophylactic antibiotics. It's one of the top 2 causes of antimicrobial resistance, and both of the top 2 causes just keep getting worse. And then chapter 4 is about pandemic risk. In July of 2020, the UN Environment Program and the International Livestock Research Institute released a report. They pulled together 18 of the leading zoonotic disease experts in the world. They listed the 7 most likely causes of the next pandemic. Number one on their list was increased meat consumption, and number two on their list was industrial animal farming. So increased meat consumption, more animals means more potential vectors for disease. Industrial animal farming, both because the animals are so genetically similar, they don't have the immune systems to fight off disease. So if one of them gets sick, they're going to all get sick. And then also the conditions that they're in are basically disease breeding grounds. So that's, essentially those are the harms of the current system. And then in chapter 5, I say, but people are not going to eat less meat. So it's just like you can say, here's the harm of, combustion engine cars and trucks. So you can say, here's the harm of the fact that we just keep consuming more and more and more energy. And so, coal, gas, the harms of fossil fuels. But people are not going to consume less energy. They've never consumed less energy in all of time. If income's going up, energy consumption is going to go up. If income's going up, meat consumption is going to go up. The solution cannot be, further to your point earlier, it can't be rely on human beings to consume less. They're just not gonna. But we can make cars that don't require gasoline, and we can make energy from wind and the sun, and we can make meat from plants, or we can make meat using tissue engineering.
Right. You're reminding me. I know you've been on Zoe Weil's podcast. She's a friend of mine up here in Maine, and I've learned a lot from her in terms of the ethical side here of what we eat. And she also talks about the implicit need for trade-offs. A lot of us a lot of people in the environmental movement have had these sort of, you see the word no a lot, like no this, that, and the other. And what people don't understand sometimes is that there will be a way for people to find meat one way or the other. And I'm thinking about Richard Conniff, a really great natural history writer, who recently posted about bushmeat. In Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, people are slaughtering everything that exists, not just for rural consumption, but it goes into cities and is sold in restaurants. And he makes the case for chickens. And yeah, chicken poultry cultivation can be unethical and the like too. But I think it would fit Zoe's vegan nature. She has this most good, least harm way of looking at these things. Do you find when you're discussing this with folks out there, whether they're vegan or carnivores or from a cattle state or not, is this issue of either or part of the problem?
The issue of either or is definitely problematic. I wouldn't put it right at the top of the list. I think right at the top of the list is really failure of human imagination to imagine a future that's different from the present. Like you, I think Zoe's. I actually have her book right within arm shot.
Cool.
And she has a quote from Jane Goodall on the cover, which is very nice. Jane also endorsed me, which is very kind. One of the points I make in the book is that the real challenge for pastoralists, the real challenge for smallholder farmers and subsistence fishing communities is the industrialization of agriculture. In chapter 1 of the book, I talk about how this guy, Jean Ziegler, who was the global envoy on food security to the United Nations, the global envoy on hunger to the United Nations back in 2007, he held a press conference at the UN and he denounced biofuels as a crime against humanity. And he pointed out that 100 million metric tons of corn and cereals was being turned into fuel, even as hundreds of millions of people were starving. And George Monbiot, the Guardian columnist, wrote a column at the time, and he said, hey, wait a minute, that same FAO report that you're citing says that 756 million metric tons of corn and cereals are fed to farm animals. So if 100 million wasted, from your perspective on biofuels is a problem, what about 756 million cycled through animals in this shockingly inefficient system? And the thing about that is we are now funneling 1.4 billion metric tons of crops through farm animals, including about 80% of the global soy crop, which is the number 2 cause of deforestation. And it's almost all to feed chickens and pigs and farm fish. The number one cause of deforestation, of course, is grazing ruminants. So, 1 and 2 top causes of deforestation. One is ruminants eating meat, and 2 is crops to feed chickens and pigs and farm fish.
Yeah. So we're going to walk through a little bit more of the book before we get into a couple more and a couple other themes here. You lay out what the problem is. You start to talk about the science, and then comes the innovation side. We already described how it's really underinvested, whether it's government money or basic science, or whether it's industry. Can you talk about this transition period a little bit toward where we are now, where you had sort of the Impossible Foods project and the whole arena, kind of the meat alternatives? Well, no, that's a phrase that I'll save that for later. The plant-based meat-like substances kind of hit a wall, and but you're involved with that now too. So what does that whole innovation network look like now, and maybe in a few years, that it didn't look like five years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start with just saying we say alternative meats rather than meat alternatives. So,
Right.
This is a phone, even though it doesn't have a cord. And most people now just say, "Hey, have you seen my phone?" They don't say, "Hey, have you seen my mobile phone or my cell phone or whatever?" They just say,
Right.
"Hey, have you seen my phone?" 25 years ago, something like 99% of phones plugged into a wall. Now, I would guess that as a percentage of phone calls, it's surely 99.9% of phone calls. I mean, add in text messaging, which 25 years ago almost nobody did. I guess 30 years ago nobody did. So we've just radically changed how we communicate. And similarly, a car up until 30 years ago, actually up until 20 years ago, all cars had combustion engines and required gas. And people might refer to their electric car, but mostly people, I think everybody now just refers to their car.
Right.
And it's a car and it's a phone, even though it doesn't, it has something that's different from what used to be true of cars and phones. So meat is the experience of eating meat. And if you can make something that's indistinguishable using plants, that's still meat. And if cultivated meat is literally the exact same thing, just a lot cleaner and safer. So alternative meats rather than meat alternatives is how we have the conversation. And I tell a bunch of stories in the book. Chapter 6 is about cultivated meat. Chapter 7 is about plant-based meat. In chapter 7, I have the "You're not the next impossible" sort of history of plant-based meat, and how many of the companies that came along were basically the next Garden Burger, not the next Impossible Foods. And it's a science project, so it really does require it's not a culinary endeavor, it's a science endeavor. We need plant fats and proteins to behave like animal fats and proteins. We need to mimic the umami flavor of meat. And it looks like that's not impossible, but it is hard. And it does require scientists. And I talk about both Pat Brown and Ethan Brown, the founders of Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat, respectively, no relation, and the fact that they saw it as a science challenge, because it is a science challenge. And there have been really surprisingly few other plant-based meat companies that are focused on the right problem, which means they're not going to get to the right solution if they're not focused on the right problem. Cultivated meat, maybe counterintuitively, is a lot easier to understand because it's just, let's grow meat in basically meat breweries instead of growing meat on farms and not requiring farms and slaughterhouses. And it's just a different way of producing the exact same product. And if it's fish, it's not going to have mercury or dioxin contamination. If it's land animal meat, it's not going to have any of the 100 drugs that FDA and USDA have minimal acceptable intake levels of. I mean, I don't know about you, Andy, but I'll bet most of the people who are listening to this or watching this who eat meat would rather have zero ivermectin or ractopamine in their meat.
Oh, yeah.
But USDA and FDA, they beg to differ for those drugs and about 100 more. They have minimum, or I guess maximum daily intakes that they consider to be acceptable in the meat supply. So cultivated meat is just like, it's much less likely to have bacterial contamination because there are no animals with digestive tracts. It's not going to require the drugs to grow the meat, so you're not going to have the drug residues. It's just, it's literally the exact same thing. And the science is looking, we have a ways to go, especially on scaling and designing the cultivators that will be producing the meat at 200,000 liters instead of 5,000 liters. But we're moving in the right direction.
And I guess, as with so many things, China is moving in that direction pretty aggressively too. Heat Map just had a package on this.
Yeah, and there's another report that I think launches next week. Some really interesting work that was funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation and a sustainable development goal think tank called Systemic. And I believe they're launching the report on maybe the 28th or the 30th. And it's looking at how much China is doing in this area. And that also is something that keeps the issue really quite bipartisan. As I mentioned, my piece in foreign policy starts with a dozen Republican members of Congress writing to DNI and DHS about China's work in this area, and the fact that right now the innovation is happening in the United States, the science is happening in the United States. I mean, it's kind of all over, but the early pioneers were, and the top companies still are, in the US. But you think about something like EV batteries, both generation 1 and generation 2 of EV batteries were designed, they came out of the Department of Energy.
Right.
And now China, I think last year, China was like $650 billion from their EV industry, where 15 years ago it was literally zero. And they just, they lapped us because they produce things so efficiently. And so you look at all the work that's happening in China on plant-based meat and cultivated meat. Of the 20 most active patent holders in the world, 8 of them are in China. 3 are in the US, 3 in Korea, 3 in Israel, 8 in China. But it's still very much ours to lose. So we have most of the top scientists, most of the top companies, but China has a huge incentive to shift in this direction because of food self-sufficiency issues. And President Xi is prioritizing it. The Chinese government is prioritizing it.
But now I want to go back in time a little bit to your origin story and the origin of my interest in this too. Can you just talk through a little bit about your transition, your track? Or I don't know if it's even fair to say it was a transition, but what got you into this arena appears from the outside to be the ethical questions, which weren't stressed in the first part of your book. You were talking about very pragmatic things like antibiotic resistance and deforestation. My son, our older son, when he was 12, he was working on a farm in the Hudson Valley, and he was going to be the gizzard boy, like in line in the slaughter. This is a sustainable agriculture farm, but he saw, he got to deal with living animals, livestock animals, and he saw what happens when they're killed. And it made him not pure vegetarian, but it certainly changed his consciousness about meat. So what was your track, just briefly, that took you through PETA and on to having this $1 million contest and now really being deeply ingrained in the idea of these alternative meats?
Yeah, so the founding concept of the Good Food Institute, like our sort of founding question we were trying to answer, was how are we going to feed something like 10 billion people by 2050 without burning the planet to a crisp? So the sort of guiding questions of GFI were focused on feed the hungry and do it without maximum environmental damage. So further to something you said earlier, the World Resources Institute says that on a business as usual trajectory, we're going to have no forests left. We're going to have no savannas left. There are going to be no wild places left. We're already using 3 billion hectares of land for animal agriculture. It's about 80% of agricultural land. That's the size of China plus India times 2. And we're going to need double that on our current path with the upward meat trajectory if we're eating something like 60% more meat in 2050. So that was the sort of founding concept of GFI. That's also where I started. So in 1987, I read a book called Diet for a Small Planet. And Diet for a Small Planet is basically chapters 1 and 2 of meat, but the statistics are updated. And in chapter 5, I say, I don't think telling people to eat less meat is going to be the way that we solve this problem, which is obviously the solution of Diet for a Small Planet. But it got me. I mean, it turned me vegan 39 years ago. And at that point, like my primary reason for living was to, and really still, like the thing that most that appeals to me at the most visceral level is hunger and malnutrition. And so 1987, I read Diet for a Small Planet. She points out the inefficiency of cycling crops through animals. She points out that in a global agricultural system, what that means is we're driving up the price of food, driving up the price of land, and we're literally, because people in developed economies are eating so much meat, we're literally contributing to the hunger and malnutrition of hundreds of millions of people. So that was the thing, and I talk about this in the introduction to the book. So, confirmation class when I was 12, my pastor saying, what you all need to do is solve global hunger, me taking it probably more seriously than any of the other people in the class. I get to college and I joined a group called Poverty Action Now. We organized fasts to raise money for Oxfam International. And we went every weekend and volunteered at the homeless shelter and soup kitchen in Des Moines, which was a big city when I was in college. And then I ran a homeless shelter and a soup kitchen for 6 years in inner city Washington, D.C. I taught through Teach for America for a couple of years in inner city Baltimore. I majored in college, I majored in economics and studied resource economics. And I wrote my senior thesis on structural adjustment programs and posited basically that we have created this neo-colonial, I mean, it basically was just building on what Francis Moore Lepay was talking about, but putting it in terms of macroeconomics. So really making the case, the title of the book was Whatever the French is for the Dice Are Loaded. And so really accusing the World Bank and the IMF of entrenching global poverty and creating these neo-colonial relationships and calling it Chicago School economics. And so that was so really GFI. And then when I was running the home shelter and the soup kitchen, I read a book called Christianity and the Rights of Animals by an Anglican priest and theologian named Andrew Lindsay. And so this would have been maybe 1993 or 1994. I read this book. So at that point, I'd been vegan for years for human rights reasons, for hunger and malnutrition reasons. But that book really spoke to me. I mean, Lindsay basically posits a liberation theology. He basically takes the Matthew 25, as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me, like that concept, which was my reason for focusing on global poverty. That was what we focused on in my confirmation class a decade before that. And he says, hey, look, animals were designed to give glory to God. Animals were designed to breathe fresh air and raise their young. They are made of the same things that we are made of. They have the same physiological senses that we have. And the way they're treated in modern industrial animal agriculture is indefensible. So that really spoke to me. And I went and worked in animal protection for a bunch of years, including at PETA and also at Farm Sanctuary. And then just watching meat consumption go up and up and up and up. And then hearing Pat Brown, Ethan Brown, Josh Tetrick, who I'd been friends with for decades. He founded a company called Hampton Creek at that point. Now it's Eat Just. So I mean, it just sort of rocked my world. The idea, hey, wait a minute. Meat is made up of amino acids and lipids and minerals and water. Plants also have amino acids and lipids and minerals and water. Let's do what renewable energy is doing. Let's do what electric vehicles is doing. Let's give people the meat that they love, but let's do it with plants. And then I met, so that was the founding idea of GFI. And then I met Uma Valeti, the founder and CEO of Upside Foods. Then it was Memphis Meats. And he convinced me. And then when GFI started hiring staff in June of 2016, we hired 2 scientists of our first 6 hires, other than me, were scientists, and they were charged with basically mapping the technological readiness of plant-based and cultivated meat at price and taste parity. And on the basis of that work, we added cultivated meat to our mandate because we came out thinking that it really has a lot of promise.
And were you at PETA when they did the $1 million
Yeah, I was.
prize? And that did, I think, well, it certainly got a lot of attention. I wrote about it, and many others did. Did it? How did that? Was that a spur that you could kind of noticeably sort of assess in the track toward where we are now?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I feel like my trajectory is just like a lot of realizing how obtuse I was in retrospect. So like I'm 12 or 13 years old, and I apparently don't really know about global hunger. And then suddenly, oh my God, global hunger! I've got to focus on that. And then I get to college, and it didn't occur to me that you have to funnel crops through animals in this incredibly inefficient system. But I read Diet for a Small Planet, and it sort of rocks my world. I read Christianity and the Rights of Animals, and it rocks my world again. Yeah, I mean, it was not, that was like, despite the fact that I did a bunch of interviews about cultivated meat, like it just didn't really occur to me that it was a real thing. It really in 2013, Mark Post, who I mentioned earlier, the Maastricht tissue engineer, and he previously was a medical doctor, taught medicine at Harvard. And Sergey Brin gave him $1 million. He created some burgers. Each burger cost like $330,000, I think. And for me, it was like, okay, that's interesting that you can do that, but that's never going to be helpful. I mean, it really was the person who I'm addressing in chapter 6 through 8 of the book. And it just didn't occur to me to focus on that. And really, I was foisting plant-based meat on all my friends and families, but it didn't occur to me that we should be doing the science of getting it to price and taste parity. And with cultivated meat, it really was Uma Valetti who said, no, this isn't 50 years, this isn't 50 years from now, this is now. And then hiring scientists to dive in and do a disinterested look. And they were like, yeah, it appears very likely. And over the years since, it has appeared more and more likely as we dive in and solve more and more of the scientific challenges with, relatively speaking, just not that much money, not that much effort. So, yeah.
So, which is very exciting in the end, I think. In 2008, that's when I in the Times, I saw what was going on a little bit, and I thought really hard, well, what would be the first thing you'd want to, what's the first meat? And I thought foie gras, because it doesn't have a lot of texture, right? So it's just stuff, paste almost. And I posted sort of fanciful 2 different pieces saying this would be where to go. And when I was in grad school, I did my journalism master's thesis on the future of organ transplantation, and I learned a lot about liver, and liver tissue is very proliferative. And I thought, oh man, and it didn't really, nothing happened. And then here we are, So fast forward to 2025, and here's the Wall Street Journal: lab-grown meat goes upscale with faux foie gras. And it's not faux; this is the actual. Again, faux is not the right word.
Yeah, no, it's right. That's right. It's it's an Australian company called Bao Foods. I talk about them in the book. They've done some of the most interesting cultivator design work. They have a former engineer from SpaceX is their chief technology officer, and they've really revolutionized how we were thinking even just 5 years ago about what the challenge is going to look like to design the cultivators that actually produce the cultivated meat. It reminded me a lot. There's a brilliant book called How Solar Energy Became Cheap by a University of Wisconsin professor named Greg Nemeth. And in the book, he tells the story of this Chinese scientist who really is the reason that solar is shooting up the S-curve. I mean, it's so fascinating how many different examples there are of like specific people who, if they had not done what they did in the precise moment that they did it, we would be sitting here assuming that solar is never going to amount to anything because the science and engineering simply don't work. And there's this one guy who was just incredibly charismatic. And Nemeth, Professor Nemeth tells a story of him basically calling in all of these connections that he had made while he was working in a lab at the University of New South Wales. And he's like flying around buying all of this equipment to make solar cells, and all of these solar cell, like he's just basically taking things that were designed for other things and like buying them for a tenth of what they cost and repurposing them. And we really thought that was what we were going to have to do for cultivated meat, that basically we need to buy bioreactors from the pharma industry and then figure out how to repurpose them. And it turns out that if what you are growing is tissue for human therapeutics, there are lots of things that you need that you don't need if you're growing meat. And the stuff that Vow did as they were making foie gras is just like super fascinating. And it's like a tenth the cost that were our most optimistic predictions for like a 15-year time frame, and they're already there. And we found that with a lot of the other challenges and too, as well as like, what you're going to feed to the cells ends up being far less expensive than anybody fathomed, and other things. There is another cultivated meat company that's doing foie gras that is in France, called Gourmet, and they've applied for, I think they might have even gotten approval in Singapore. They've applied for approval from the European Union, and a few other places. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening.
And what do you see as the frontiers? What would make the difference? Just this is, and I've dealt with this issue with the energy question too. Where along the trend, the pipeline from basic science to innovation to expansion is the biggest gap right now, or maybe two or three things that, if you could lubricate that chain, where would you see the greatest potential?
I mean, the biggest challenge, and the thing that we like absolutely need to solve on both the plant-based side and the cultivated side, is going to be engineering for production. So it's bioengineering, mechanical engineering. What does it look like? I mean, so Vow has done just pioneering work in this area, but I think their largest bioreactor is still 20,000 liters. It's very unlikely that we're going to be able to get to cost competitiveness if our largest bioreactors are 20,000 liters, like most of the modeling. This is a pretty big dispute in the world of cultivated meat engineering. So there are people who think that we can scale out and have lots of 20 to 50,000 liter bioreactors, cultivators. But most people think we're going to need really big, 200,000 liters, even up to 1 million liters. And figuring out how to do that, and then also raising the capital to do that. Venture capital has been the primary source of money in cultivated meat. Venture capital is notoriously unenthusiastic about CapEx costs. So on both the plant-based side and the cultivated side, designing the systems to churn out the meat and finding the money to design the systems to churn out the meat. And this is an area where China excels. So, I mean, our expectation is that China may pioneer here as well. And our hope is that other countries will decide, this is a $2 trillion industry. We would prefer that China not own it all by itself. And then, I mentioned earlier the Center for Strategic and International Studies. They wrote a 4,500 word report about alternative proteins. And it's basically focused on the US government. And it says the US should prioritize alternative proteins, our industries, in the same way we prioritize advanced chips for AI and biopharma. Any country that does that and helps with production in the same way that we do with advanced chips and biopharma, I think is going to be able to really innovate in this space. And the last thing I'll say on that is just the person who was my number one choice to write the foreword for the book is Caitlin Welsh. She had been at the Department of State under Barack Obama in his second term. She served almost all of Trump's first term at the National Security Council. She left and now runs the Global Food and Water Security Program at CSIS. And she did, in fact, write the foreword, which I think really does underline, it really helps, I think, to keep the issue bipartisan, to have a think tank that in the pre-MAGA world was considered to be center-right. Now it's a little different to sort of categorize, but they're certainly very well respected by establishment Republicans, national security focused Republicans. It just doesn't get any more authoritative. And that I think also helps to keep us out of the culture wars and to keep the issues bipartisan.
Is it helpful? And we have just a few minutes left, but is it helpful? Let me back up. My wife used to teach teachers how to inject systems thinking into their teaching as a part of a sustainability education project. But systems thinking and systems action, it's easier to have a hypothetical talk about that, and it's harder for even at the level of national security for people to put these buckets into one picture, especially when you're talking about something like food, which is every issue. It's land, it's culture, it's is the lack of a sort of systemic capacity for decision making something that's a fundamental issue, and or are recent global realities around the constraints that come when systems break, like the Strait of Hormuz shutting off fertilizer, not just oil, maybe jogging us toward this becoming more actualized?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something I was. So the Bezos Earth Fund had a book event a couple of nights ago for me and for Mike Grunwald, who you mentioned earlier, and we had Eliza Barclay, who's the climate editor for the Times Now,
Sure.
moderating the event. And this was one of the topics that we were talking about. How these and the thing I was going to say, Caitlin Welsh from CSIS came. And she was talking about how the situation with the Strait of Hormuz and also fertilizer prices skyrocketing. And it's one more example of the fragility of the food system. So, in chapter 1 of the book, I'm talking about the inefficiency leading to hunger and malnutrition. And then in chapter 9 I'm talking about the fact that because it is so inefficient to cycle crops through animals, it's also a $2 trillion economic opportunity if we can figure out how to make the meat that people love, but without all of that inefficiency, it's just going to be incredibly profitable. And that's the reason that the meat industry and all of the major meat companies are enthusiastic about these technologies. And of course, that helps to keep things bipartisan. And then chapter 10 of the book, again, the inefficiencies that I talk about in chapter 1 and chapter 2 also mean that meat really leads to food self-sufficiency issues. So when China joined the WTO in, I think, 2002, 2003, they were producing, their food self-sufficiency percentage was 100. And now it's somewhere like 65% because they are eating so much more meat, and meat requires so much more land, and they have to import massive amounts of soy from Brazil and until recently from the United States. And they would prefer not to do that. Their leaders remember famine. And then, also the fragility of the food system, which I think is underlined by what's happening with the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody wants to be beholden to some strait that nobody even heard of a couple of years ago. I know that's not true. Many people had heard of it. I hadn't heard of it up until fairly recently. And, suddenly we realize that, oh my God, that's where the fertilizer comes from. Or when the war in Ukraine happened, suddenly papers all over the world were talking about how it could spell famine and huge price spikes because 50 million metric tons of wheat globally is exported from Ukraine. Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, 1.4 billion metric tons of food that is grown is fed to farm animals. That's almost 30 times as much every single year. It really does, sort of give us a launching pad to have conversations about the fragility of the food system currently, the fragility of meat, because it has so many extra stages of production and requires so many more resources. It is an opportunity for countries that care about food self-sufficiency. So countries like Korea and Japan and Singapore and Israel and China, or countries that care about food systems resilience, which is all countries, to basically shift in the right direction on those issues.
Do you a last question? Do you have your own sense of how soon it will be that I can go down to the Hannaford's here and get ground beef and that is a lab grown.
Yeah, I mean, chapter 11 of the book is basically answering that question, and it sort of flips it. So, chapter 6, 7, 8 really dive into the science. Chapter 11 is like, where are we now, and where do we need to get to? And it is possible, but it's not inevitable. Which is why the Good Food Institute exists, to make it happen as quickly as possible. One of the stories I tell is how in the first 10 years of the 20th century, more than 500 car companies went out of business. And Woodrow Wilson, who was president of Princeton University, said in 1906 that automobiles will never be more than a plaything for the idle rich, because they were really hard to start, they were breaking down constantly, and they were really expensive. In 1908, Henry Ford solves those first two problems and puts us on the trajectory of solving the third. And 20 years later, the automobile industry was the largest industry in America. So the question is, how do we get to that 1908 moment? You can tell a similar story about internet commerce and Amazon's stock price falling from more than $215 to under $6, so 97%. And the commentary globally being, whoever thought people were going to want to buy pet supplies or books online, what a joke. And we solved the problems. We made it more familiar. We got landlines. There are just so many similar examples. So the challenge for plant-based meat and cultivated meat is both A, to make sure that we stay out of the "this never happened because we didn't bring the will" category. Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein talk about all the innovations that are still waiting to be invented. This is one of those. How do we get to that 1908 moment, basically? And the book concludes with a lot of thoughts about how the reader can help us get to that 1908 moment for plant-based meat and cultivated meat, the point at which we hit price and taste parity, and then we really shoot up the S-curve of adoption. That's where we're trying to get to. And I think cultivated meat is inevitable, but it could be a really long time if we don't get the innovators and don't get the government support for scaling. But we're on the right path. I mean, we're trending in the right direction. So I'm really quite optimistic.
Well, I'm really glad you're doing what you're doing, and the Good Food Institute is doing what it's doing, and the innovators and scientists who are out there, digging in, are doing what they're doing. This has been a great introduction to the question. I did have Michael Grunwald on here a while back talking about the food picture more widely. There's more to do always. And thanks, Bruce, for coming on Sustain What? And maybe we can check back in and have some foie gras that didn't require fattening and slaughtering a zillion geese and ducks.
I would love that, Andy. Thank you so much for having me on. I enjoyed it.
Take care. This is a episode of Sustain What? You can get in touch with me for about future ideas using this distracting scrolling bar at the bottom, and share this when we're done with everybody. It'll go on my Substack shortly. And thanks again, Bruce.
Thank you.
Hold on one second.